Hello folks, welcome to the second part of our Hazard Prep unit. We're going to be talking about how disaster response is coordinated and planned for at the local and national level. We're also going to talk about what happens when these plans are put into action and what that might mean for someone in the surgical tech role. So we're going to start out talking about the coordination of local response to disaster, since local governments have the first responsibility for response. We'll start with the National Incident Management System, aka NIMS. The NIMS is a national set of guidelines put into place for local hazard prep coordination. It's a model for how local responses should be planned, and it guides coordination of resources and responders in disaster planning and can be adapted to any size disaster. In order for federal money to be used for hazard prep, the NIMS must be followed. So let's talk about LEMA, or the Local Emergency Management Agency. It's mandated by the NIMS, which we learned about on the last slide. LEMA is the local lead management and coordinating authority. It uses NIMS as a guide to coordinate local agencies like the fire department, emergency medical services, and police. So NIMS is the guidelines, the national guidelines. LEMA is the actual local agency. Okay? So the LEMA is also responsible for maintaining an emergency operations plan, or EOP. An EOP says who's in charge of what. The EOP will include an inventory of available resources, including supplies and equipment, as well as personnel such as a first responder or a doctor. A big part of the EOP is the All Hazards Plan. Now, the term All Hazards refers to a plan that can be used to respond to all hazards, that's big or small. It's adaptable to anything versus needing several plans for different types of disasters. An EOC, or Emergency Operations Center, is when, as soon as a disaster strikes, whoever's in charge of LEMA, that local agency, activates their Emergency Operations Center. This is a physical place designated by the EOP, okay, or the Emergency Operations Plan. So this is where personnel from all agencies responding to the disaster will meet to implement the EOP, or the Emergency Operations Plan, and coordinate the local response to disaster. So putting this all together, we have the Local Emergency Management Agency, or LEMA, who uses NIMS, which is the national guideline, to create an emergency operations plan, which includes, among other things, the development of an emergency operations center, which is the physical place, the center of their operations in the event of a disaster. So, everyone meets at the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, which is a place predetermined by the EOP, the Emergency Operations Plan. Once there will be a chain of command set in place called the Incident Command System, or the ICS for short. This chain of command and the whole EOP is set up by the LEMA, that local agency. The person in charge of the Incident Command System, or ICS, is called the Incident Commander. This person is in charge of staying in that EOC and coordinating the disaster response in accordance with the EOP, the plan. Now, sometimes the person in the role of incident commander may realize that the job is just too big for one person, or they need specialized knowledge in order to coordinate different parts of the response. So remember that these plans have to be adaptable to disasters of all sizes. In the case where the job is too big for one person to be in charge of it all, the incident commander can appoint more leaders to help in the leadership of the incident command system. This is called a unified command, or UC for short. So when this happens, the leadership role is broken into as many as 4 additional groups in addition to the role of command, which is held by the incident commander. You can think of these 4 additional roles as the incident commander's little helpers. The 4 additional roles in unified command are the operations group, the planning group, the logistics group, and the finance and administration group. We're going to go through these in just a moment. So let's go a bit deeper into this unified command. The incident commander's little helpers are in charge of 4 different reporting groups. Each group has its own responsibilities and reports back to the command. So the operations group carries out the actual tasks of disaster response. For example, these are the folks actually providing medical care to injured individuals. These are the folks searching for missing persons in the rubble of fallen structures. These are the people filling sandbags to keep floodwaters back. The planning group gathers and documents continual updates and information on the emergency and reports back to the command. This is helpful because the decisions made by command can be altered based on the success or failures reported by the planning group. The logistics group establishes the emergency response infrastructure. For example, they work out how to transport victims from the scene to a safer place. They work out what to feed survivors and how to keep them sheltered, what to give them to sleep on, how many porta potties will be needed, and where do you put them, how to be sure the ICS continues to have electricity and communication with the rest of the response groups, how to maintain that communication if the cell towers go down, for example. The Finance and Administration Group records the costs of disaster response. This will be useful later when government aid or tax breaks may be needed later on to help accommodate for the cost of a disaster in a certain region. So let's take this on a larger scale. When the federal response gets involved, if the governor of a state requests that the president declare that a disaster is a federal disaster, and then he or she does so, the response will receive federal assistance. This may come in the form of food, supplies, or personnel such as health professionals. The local ICS is still in charge of coordinating activities in this situation. Let's talk about FEMA, though. The Federal Emergency Management System, FEMA for short, is a division of the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS for short. They love their acronyms. Like LEMA in local hazard prep, FEMA is the lead agency during nationally declared emergencies. They're in charge of coordinating treatment, food, and shelter. Like the NIMS in local hazard prep, the National Response Framework, or NRF for short, is a guide for coordinating the disaster relief activities when a presidential declaration of national emergency has been made. Similar to the All Hazards Plan of the Local Emergency Operations Plan, the NRF is scalable. This means that it's adaptable to disasters of all sizes. National Disaster Medical System, or NDMS for short, enacts the NRF by sending out the needed medical equipment, supplies, and teams to assist in disaster response. There's over 100 NDMS medical teams located throughout the United States. There are different types of medical response teams, but the three most well-known are the DMATs, the DMORTs, and the NPRTs. The DMATs are Disaster Medical Assistance Teams. These are teams of healthcare workers that can be rapidly deployed to assist and supplement the existing healthcare practitioners. So surgical technologists with special training in first aid, dressings, splintings, and IVs are on DMATs. They may also be on specialty surgical teams like ortho teams. The DMATs are not intended to take over or to replace the local healthcare workers, but rather to meld in and reinforce the effort that's already there. As a surgical tech on a DMAT, you would potentially be used in surgery, but may be more useful elsewhere. DMATs help where they are needed. The DMORTs are disaster mortuary operations teams. These are teams of medical examiners, pathologists, radiographers, and dental assistants. So these personnel are there to help document the identity of victims. The NPRTs are national pharmacy response teams. These are pharmacists and pharmacy techs who dispense drugs and vaccines in a disaster area. Over 1,000 hospitals in the United States are registered as NDMS hospitals. These are the hospitals that victims from a national disaster will be taken to. Let's talk a bit now about the hospital's response to disaster. In order to remain in compliance with Joint Commission, hospitals are required to maintain and regularly practice their scalable emergency action plan. The word scalable, again, refers to the plan's ability to adjust to fit the needs of all sizes of disaster. The Hospital Incident Command System and Emergency Action Plan mirror the functions of the Incident Command System and the Emergency Operations Plan within local response, if you can think back to those first few slides. The Emergency Action Plan at the hospital has 4 components: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Mitigation is identification of potential hazards and preparing in a way that will prevent and decrease damage. The example in your text is having folks that live in heavily forested areas clear the vegetation from around their home. So if a forest fire starts up, the cleared area may save their home. Another example of mitigation would be advising people in cold climates like Wisconsin winters to leave their kitchen cabinets open or their faucet on a slow trickle when the temperature gets below a certain point. These mitigation efforts may keep the pipes from freezing when the frost level reaches them. Preparedness in the hospital is the development of an emergency action plan and an emergency operations center where, you'll remember from local response, is the physical place where the hospital incident command system will meet and coordinate the response. Response is the actions taken by individuals before or during the disaster event. And recovery is the activities undertaken after the disaster. So the goal is to return the hospital and the community back to its pre-disaster condition. The Hospital Incident Command System, or HICS for short, is similar to the Local Response Incident Command System. It clarifies the roles of different healthcare practitioners through the use of job action sheets. The job action sheets are a tool used to describe a person's role in hazard preparedness. Evacuation. The emergency action plan for a hospital will outline an evacuation plan. Shelter in place may be one evacuation option within the plan. Shelter in place is evacuation into another part of the hospital that offers better protection from the disaster. There are some specific issues that must be addressed when moving patients. Where will be the safest place to stage patients in anticipation of transportation? A form must be included in the plan that will aid in documenting patients and their whereabouts after evacuation. The documentation will also indicate the patient's condition. Part of planning is the development of Memorandums of Understanding, or MOUs for short. MOUs are written agreements between hospitals that they'll accept each other's patients in the event of an evacuation. Medical records should be kept digitally in an off-site storage. The use of laptops for accessing medical records during disaster is advantageous because laptops contain batteries that allow the laptop to keep working if the power goes out. Part of the EAP is to have a list of all of the supplies and medications needed to go into the refrigerator. So all of the medications needing refrigeration. A backup gas-powered generator may be used to back up the hospital's generators and ensure power to the refrigerator. In the event of an emergency, the healthcare practitioner must be aware of what his or her personal and departmental responsibilities are. The HICS, or Hospital Incident Command System, will provide a clear chain of command which must be respected for the system to work. He or she must also be aware of the signals and codes that the hospital uses in the event of emergency. So most hospitals are beginning to use plain English as opposed to color codes, etc., but you must learn how your specific hospital does it. There will be procedures in place indicating the process for communicating between the HICS and the departments, as well as communicating the activation of the EAP itself. The emergency action plan of a medical office or standalone outpatient surgery center should coordinate with the local community emergency response procedures. The plan should address procedures for communicating with staff that there's been an emergency. It should also address specific procedures for evacuation. Where will the common meeting place for employees and patients to be accounted for? Where will patients with disabilities, decreased range of motion, or other special needs be transported to? What gases, oxygen, or other critical items need to be turned off as part of evacuation? Similar to hospital response, the medical office or surgery center will need to have procedures in place for both sending and receiving medical records securely as needed. Finally, the medical office or surgical center may be sophisticated enough to act as a temporary receiving facility for the overflow of patients from the hospital. Assuming an MOU has been agreed upon, the emergency action plan should have procedures for providing care to the non-routine patient, a sudden high volume of patients, and how or where to find beds and stretchers for them. As I mentioned briefly earlier, mitigation helps to reduce the potential for casualties. As a mitigation effort, the healthcare professionals may create a safe zone. This is a zone outside of the disaster area that can be used as a place for triage. Evacuation orders are considered mitigation efforts because it sends employees and patients to a safer location, hopefully decreasing the number of casualties. Hazardous items should be stored in a way that is secure and safeguarded against whatever disaster may come along. So communication with Lima should be initiated as soon as possible so that the EOP can be initiated. This will potentially decrease casualties as well. Law enforcement contribute to mitigation efforts by enforcing mandates, curfew orders, no entry to hazardous zones, etc. Finally, people should be addressing their own unique security needs in order to apply mitigation efforts within their own families. The immediate response to an all-hazards event will include several actions. An incident command site needs to be set up. This should be in a safe place since the disaster response will be coordinated from this location. Some methods for communication need to be established based on the needs specific to the event. A triage area needs to be set up. This also needs to be in a safe place. We'll talk more about triage in a future slide. Along with incident command and triage, an area needs to be set up for documentation of patients themselves. Depending on the nature of disaster, the response will need to include preparations for special needs patients. If needed, a point of distribution site may be able to give medications and vaccines. A point of distribution, or POD for short, is a temporary site for distribution of medication and vaccines. The medication and vaccines come in a push pack sent from one of the strategic national stockpiles. A push pack is a pre-packaged pack of medications ready to be shipped at a moment's notice. When the push pack arrives, the National Pharmacy Response Team is there to take inventory and to distribute as needed. There will usually be an appointed spokesperson who's responsible for relaying pertinent information about the disaster to the public. Under normal circumstances, television, email, cell phones, reverse call service, radios, and newspapers are the preferred methods of communications. Depending on the disaster, one or more of those options may not be open to you. In a disaster situation, written information given out by hand and fire and police going door to door would be more effective. Barriers to effective communication with the public are language barriers, the very old and very young patients, and those with hearing difficulties. Cross-contamination needs to be avoided and prevented in the field of an emergency just the same as if it were in the hospital. This can be achieved by using standard precautions, that is, to assume that everyone is infected and wear your personal protective equipment, or PPE for short. In addition to using standard precautions, it's important that any victim who could potentially be contaminated as well goes through decontamination procedures. This is especially important in chemical and radiological disasters. There will be separate men's and women's shelters for decontam, and typically clothing must be removed, any wounds are cleaned and dressed, soap and water are used to decontaminate the victim's skin in a radiological disaster. In chemical disaster decontamination, the skin must be decontaminated using bleach diluted 1:9 with water, then flushed with saline. Disposable towels and sponges are used for the decontamination procedure. Since the first step of decontamination is to have them remove their clothing, there should be some sort of gown or other cover-up for the patients. There are different systems of triage. One common method is the START method. It stands for Simple Triage and Rapid Treatment. It places patients into 4 categories: delayed, immediate, minimal, and expectant. Minimal is a green tag. It means minor injuries like cuts and bruises and sprains. Delayed is a yellow tag. The airway is good and the injuries may be present, but transport can be delayed. The immediate category has a red tag, and this means that the patient needs treatment right away within the golden hour to survive. The expectant tag is black. People with black tags are expected to die. They are made to be comfortable. As a surgical tech helping in the triage tent, you can help by providing basic life-saving procedures, first aid, and by transporting patients as needed. Those who find themselves responding in a disaster situation may find themselves also making quick decisions with decreased resources. The goal in that situation is to use the resources to reach the largest number of people as possible. This might mean choosing not to use resources, including your time, on a victim that will die regardless of your efforts. It may be difficult for health care to reach all populations during an emergency or disaster situation. Folks that are unable to come to the triage center or even leave their homes, for example. Elderly individuals or those without means of transportation. A legal and regulatory issue that is seen in disaster situations would be an out-of-state relief physician who is licensed in another state providing care. So is that person still protected under the state's laws? Another legal issue is the question about whether physicians should be immune from lawsuit because of the quick decisions and quick treatment that they had to give in that situation. The surgical tech may find themselves in several roles when supporting a response to disaster. They could become a member of a DMAT with a bit of extra training. They may be sent to help with evacuations. They may be on a specialty surgical team like an ortho team or a burn team. They may be asked to assist in triage or to transport patients. You can volunteer to be on a DMAT by pre-registering with the Emergency System for the Advanced Registration of Volunteer Health Professionals, ESAR-VHP for short. You could also become part of a more local response by receiving extra training and joining a community emergency response team. This extra training usually is sourced by the local firemen department or the Red Cross chapters. That's the end of today. That's the end of this unit. Thanks for listening. I recommend listening to this video, listening to my voice, talking this out, reading the PowerPoint through, and then outlining the response system and all of the different moving parts of the response system on your own in a way on the paper that makes sense to you. That's really going to help you understand how these things work.